Hello everyone, welcome back to Brain Blitz Audios. Today, we're starting off with an exciting new puzzle. This is a very interesting puzzle and we're here to decode it for you. This is Suguru. Suguru, also known as Tectonics or number blocks, were invented in Japan by Naoki Inaba, a very prolific puzzle designer. These puzzles have very simple instructions, but a very wide spectrum of difficulties, ranging from easy to insanely challenging. Suguru Puzzle's grid is subdivided into containers or cages, each of which is 1 to 5 cells in size. So this square containing the number 3 is a cell. However, this particular block in the top left corner is a container. You need to fill each container with unique digits, counting up from 1. For example, in a 2 square container, you will fill the numbers 1 and 2. A 5 square container contains the numbers from 1 to 5. Another important rule is that adjacent or touching cells may never contain the same number, and this includes diagonally adjacent cells. So if you were to look at this cell containing the number 3, its adjacent cells, which are here, 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 and here, cannot contain the number 3 because all of these are adjacent to the cell, and adjacent cells will not have the same number. Note that even though adjacent cells will not have the same number, the number itself can be repeated in any row or column. So that is not a problem in Tectonics. So here's an example of a Suguru puzzle. So as you can see, in these containers we're supposed to fill in numbers, and we fill in these numbers by comparing with the containers and then looking out at which of these numbers are correctly placed in each of the cells. So, enough talk about the puzzle. How are we supposed to solve it? Well, here's our method to solve a Suguru puzzle. Number 1. Mark the columns as A, B, C, D, E, etc. and mark the rows as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. This will help us to name each cell using the coordinates. For example, you can say the top left corner's cell would be A1 because it's in column A and row 1. And similarly, you can name every other cell, and you can use this nomenclature in order to, talk about which cell must contain which number. Number 2. Find small containers. They have fewer digit possibilities and can often be solved early. Number 3. Look for cells that are surrounded by all but one number. Either the numbers are explicitly filled out or they are implicit because they belong to the same container. Look for containers in which all but one remaining cell are adjacent to the same number. The non-adjacent cell must be that number. For example, in a container of 5 cells, 4 cells are adjacent to the number 4, then the cell which is not adjacent to 4 must have the number 4. So that's how you solve them. Do not forget to look for cages in which all but one value are already filled. So these cages are easier to fill. Mark each unsolved cell with the possible numbers that it may contain and solve these cells using the process of elimination. That is, if you get stuck. Now, having looked at the method to solve a Suguru puzzle, let's start off with solving a sample puzzle. So, here we have a sample puzzle, and let's start solving it. But first, let's number its rows and columns. So row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, row 5, and row 6. The columns are A, B, C, D, E, and F. Now, let's look at the containers and find out the smallest of the containers. Now, most of the containers here have 5 cells in them, but the container containing cells E2 and E1 is the smallest container. So this container has just 2 cells. And since this container has 2 cells, it only has 1 or 2. It only can contain 1 or 2. So let's write that in the center, 1 or 2. Now, when we look at the cell E3, let's look at its adjacent cells. So these 8 cells are its adjacent cells. As you can see, the numbers 3 and 2 are adjacent to the cell E3. So if you remember, adjacent cells can never have the same number, and that involves diagonally adjacent cells also. So since 2 is diagonally adjacent to E3, the number that must be filled here is 1. And the number that must be filled in E2 is 2 in order to complete the container. So let's erase everything else, our notes, so that we can move on to the next container. Now, the next smallest container here is the container containing the cells A1, B1, C1, and A2. Now, this container contains 4 cells, and it must contain the digits 1 to 4. Now, all 4 of its cells are adjacent to the cell that is B2. So as you can see, 4 is adjacent, A2 is adjacent, B1 and C1 are also adjacent. Now, since 4 is adjacent to it, it cannot have the number 4, and since this is a container with 4 cells, the numbers 1, 2, and 3 must be present in any of these cells. So therefore, the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 cannot be present in this particular cell, that is B2. And since B2 belongs to a container with 5 cells, the only number that should come here is 5. So B2 is to be filled with 5. Now, on the upper right, we have 4 enclosed cells in a container of 5 cells. These are D1, E1, F1, and D2. Now, all of these cells of the cage are adjacent to the number 2, which we filled in E2. So all of these are adjacent to the number 2. So that means D1, E1, F1, and D2 cannot have the number 2 present in them, because it would mean a violation of the rules. So that means the only cell in this container which can host the number 2 is cell number C2. So we will write 2 in cell C2 because it will be the correct place for it, and it will not violate any of the rules. Now, notice that this is a common pattern. By looking at every filled cell, you can find out the number that is to be filled in another container or another cell. So therefore, always look for this pattern. Now, another pattern that is commonly found can be applied in the cell D3. So in the cell D3, you can see that the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 are adjacent to it. 1 is adjacent, 2 is adjacent, 3 and 4 are also adjacent. So the only number that can be filled in this cell is 5. This is the number that is not adjacent to the cell D3. Also, if you look at the cell D5, we have a similar pattern. The number 1 is adjacent diagonally, 2 and 5 are adjacent, 3 is also adjacent diagonally. So the only number that can be filled here is the number 4, because 4 is not adjacent. And that means the container containing the cells D3, D4, D5, E4, and C4 only needs the cell C4 to be completed. And the only number here is 1, because every other cell has been filled with the other numbers. The only remaining number here is 1. So we have now completed, another container. Now, using the method for looking at adjacent numbers, let's look at the cell D2 now. So as you can see in the cell D2, the cell itself is adjacent to the numbers 1, 2, 4, and 5. So the only number that can be filled here is a 3. So we will duly fill 3 in that area. Now, going back to the container on the upper left, you can see that 2 of the cells, which are B1 and C1, they are adjacent to the number 2 present in the cell C2. So these 2 cells cannot be filled in with the number 2. So that means the number 2 must be filled in the cell A2. Similarly, looking at adjacent digits, you can see that the cell C1 cannot host the number 3 because it's diagonally adjacent to D2, which contains a 3. So therefore, the number 3 must be filled in the cell B1. And that means the only number that can be hosted by C1 is the number 1 in that container. Now, in this particular way, let's look at the cell D1. D1 is adjacent to the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 5. So the only number that can be filled here is a number 4. And since the cage containing C2, D2, D1, E1, and F1 has the numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 filled, the only number that can be filled in the cell F1 is the number 1. So we have now successfully completed another container. Now, we can complete the plus-shaped container, which contains the cells B2, A3, B3, C3, and B4. Now, if you look at its central cell, the central cell here is B3, and it is adjacent to the numbers 1, 2, 4, and 5. So the only number that can be filled in B3 is the number 3. And then you can see that the container's bottom cell, which is B4, it is adjacent to a 1. The only numbers that can be filled are 1 and 2. So you can see A2 is adjacent to B3, A2 is adjacent to A3, and so therefore you can't fill a 2 there. So the only number that can be filled in A3 is a 1. And that means the only number that can be filled in B4 is a 2. Again, so we have successfully completed another cage. Now, we've put a 2 in B4, which is adjacent to 4 cells. So if you can see, B4 is adjacent to the cells A4, A5, B5, and C5. So the only cell in this particular cage where the number 2 can be a possibility is in the cell A6. So in A6 you can put in the number 2. Now similarly, the bottom right squares, the bottom right cells D6, E6, and F6, all 3 of these cells are adjacent to a number 5, which is present in E5. So therefore the only number that can be filled in this horizontal cage is the only place where 5 can be filled in this horizontal cage is the cell B6. So in B6 we add a 5. And now let's use the similar logic. In cage D5, we have added the number 4. And that means this number 4 would be adjacent to the cells D6 and E6. So that means the only place where you can write the number 4 in the horizontal cage is F6. So F6 contains the number 4. And we can now use these methods in order to solve the remaining puzzle. So, if you can see, in cage C4 we have the number 1, and this number is adjacent to the cells C5 and B5. Also, the number present in A3 is a 1, and it is adjacent to A4. So these 3 cells cannot be filled with the number 1. So therefore, the only place where 1 can be filled in this particular cage is A5. So A5 contains a 1. Now, let's start off solving some other cages. So, in the cage with 5 in E5, that is this particular cage, you can see that the number in E4, that is a 3, will be adjacent to the cells F5, F4, and F3. So the only cell in this cage where 3 can be present is the cell F2. So in F2 you can write a 3. Similarly, the cell E2 contains the number 2. So that means you cannot write 2 in the cell F3. So F4 and F5 are feasible. But then we have 2 or more options, so we can eliminate them. So, how do we solve the other cells? So, let's look again at these particular cages. So, let's look at cell B6. So, the cell B6 contains a 5. So, that means the cells B5 and C5, which are adjacent to the cell, cannot have the number 5 in them. So that means the only place where 5 can be present in this container is the cell A4. So that means in order to complete this container, we will write a 2 on C5 and a 3 on B5. But then that's a problem, isn't it? Because you cannot put a 2 there. My mistake. So let's erase a 2. The only number that can be present there, the numbers here are 4 and 3. The reason being that there is a 4 on D5, which cannot allow a 4 on C5. So that means B5 contains the number 4 and C5 contains the number 3. And since C5 contains a 3, that means the cell D6 cannot have a 3. So the 3 will be present on E6. And that means the remaining number, which is 2, will be present on D6. So far, so good. Now we only have 1 container to fill here. And as you can see, the container has the cell F5. F5 is surrounded by the numbers 3, 4, and 5. Now let's look at each of the cells here. Now if we remember, okay, let's see how we can fill these numbers. So 1, 2, 3. Okay, we have 1, 2, and 3. And we already have a 5 in this container. So if you look at F3 here, the numbers that are adjacent to it are 1, 2, and 3. But we cannot add a 5 here because the problem is that E5, which is part of the container, already has a 5. So that means the only number that can be present here is a 4. Now, let's look at how to fill in 1 and 2 in this container. So this cell, which is F4, is adjacent to the cell E3, which contains a 1. So the number here is a 2, so F4 contains a 2, and the final cell to be filled, F5, contains a 1. And that concludes our puzzle. So as you can see, all of the numbers here are unique. They are unique to their particular cages, and none of them are adjacent to each other. So 3 is not adjacent to any other 3. It's not adjacent. 4 is not adjacent to any other 4, and that's how we are supposed to fill this puzzle. We hope you found this episode interesting. We will upload more videos, more practice puzzles on Suguru in the coming videos. So if you want to get more of our content, then please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and then hit the notifications icon in order to get our latest updates. You can also share your views in the comment section down below, and you can share your successes on how you have solved this puzzle, or you can put in improvements which we can make to make our puzzles more interesting. So until the next episode, take care, stay safe, bye bye for now.